Loud budgeting is another way to say having a financial boundary. Nothing like a good old TikTok trend to get us started on what we're seeing in the world of personal finance. I actually really love this one. I'm just going to break down how we can dive into it a little bit more, highlight the amazing take that Lucas Battle really nailed, and then also talking about some ways to kind of soften it so it doesn't sound like you're not worth my gas money. If you're new here, my name is Lindsay. I'm a licensed social worker, certified financial therapist, and founder of Mind Money Balance, a business on the mission of helping you learn more about the emotional, psychological, and systemic side of money. I'm also the author of the book, The Financial Anxiety Solution, that you can grab wherever books are sold, or ask your local library to grab a copy. So loud budgeting actually came in at the tail end of 2023 when all of those in and out lists were floating around. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's where people were saying out things from last year, in things for this year. And TikToker Lucas Battle said what was out was quiet luxury, and went on to talk about how loud budgeting is really what's in for this year. They say that loud budgeting is all about being really clear about your financial goals, communicating it to your friends, to your family, and being really clear about when you want to say no and giving people a little bit more information than maybe they were used to getting in the past. This, my friends, is another way to say having a boundary. As a therapist, boundaries come up all the time because I think, quite frankly, they are often misconstrued or misunderstood. A boundary is something that you as the person says, here are my expectations and here are my limits, and these are the things I will and won't tolerate. A boundary is not expecting other people to do things differently. It's just saying, here's where I'm at. Here's what works for me, here's what doesn't, and making it really clear about the types of things you will or won't engage in. We know that when we write a goal out and say it out loud, there is a higher likelihood of us actually achieving the goal, which is why loud budgeting can be so powerful. If we think about the word boundary, if you think about like a fence or a guardrail, the idea here is that it's an area in which a person feels emotionally safe and communicating that boundary to somebody, be it a friend, family member, coworker, employee, employer, doesn't matter, is really important in making sure that you're not saying yes to things that you really want to say no to, and that people are clear on what you will and won't tolerate. When it comes to setting financial boundaries, it can feel a little bit confusing and strange because so many of us just haven't had good examples of what a financial boundary looks like. So when we think about loud budgeting, basically what we're doing is we're saying, here's what's going on in my personal life that is leading me to set a financial boundary around this thing. Money can be such a loaded topic, and especially when it comes to maintaining relationships with people, let's just be honest, like life is expensive. If you want to go out with friends, if you want to spend time with family, oftentimes you're doing an activity that costs money. I think it's important to just name that a lot of the socializing in our country revolves around spending money. In other parts of the world, they have more third places. A third place is a place that is not home and is not work that you can hang out in. In the US, so many of our third places cost money to get into. Think about going to a coffee shop. Sure, you can hang out there for 90 minutes, but there might be a sign right by the cashier that says, in order to stay and use our Wi-Fi, please purchase a beverage every 90 minutes. Or if you go out to dinner, the lingering after the meal isn't really an option. Often, the server will come by, drop off the tab, double check if you need anything, and slowly usher you out of that space. A third space, a park, a library, or even places where maybe you do spend money but you aren't rushed out of, just aren't as common where I'm from, which is the United States. I think just naming that it's hard to be out here having friends, maintaining relationships without spending money. So first, when it comes to setting a financial boundary, when it comes to this idea of loud budgeting, a lot of what I'm seeing is I'm not spending money on new clothes because I'm saving up for an emergency, or I'm not spending my discretionary money on takeout because I really want to pay off my credit card debt, right? So they're being clear about what you won't spend money on because there's a bigger goal that you're saving up for. And it might feel weird to say it out loud. And so this is where I think you can know what your goals are, know what your financial priorities are and also what your financial limitations are. Once you have an idea of that, it gets easier to communicate them with people in your orbit. So often when we are setting a boundary, especially a financial one, we jump to conclusions. We catastrophize, as they call it in therapy. We imagine that the worst case scenario will happen if we set some sort of financial boundary with our friends. So for example, if a group of friends want to rent an Airbnb and get away for a long weekend and it's not in the financial cards for you to do so, or maybe you could afford it, but that's just not where your financial priorities lie. When we catastrophize, when we jump to conclusions, we think things like, if I say no, my friends will think that I'm a loser and don't want to hang out with them. Or if I say no, my friends will think I'm broke and think that I don't know how to manage my money. When we actually state a boundary, are clear about it, what we often find is that people join in with us. Rather than people saying, yeah, you are dumb and broke and don't know how to manage your money, a much more realistic scenario is something like, we're going to be bummed that you're not going to be able to make it, but we totally understand. Or even better, maybe they say, oh, I love that you just shared that you're saving up for an emergency or you're trying to pay off your credit card debt. Maybe we can find an Airbnb that's more affordable. Or maybe we can connect with a friend in a different city and just do like a housing swap for the weekend so we can experience something new, but we don't have to pay for the cost of lodging, right? You never know what people may say to you when you set a financial boundary and communicate it with people. The more that we practice this, saying, no, I can't or I won't spend money on this thing right now, the easier it becomes not only to say it, but for people to hear and respect those financial boundaries. And it might, plant a seed in your friends and your loved ones to say like, oh, maybe I don't actually want to spend money on this thing. Maybe I have some financial goals that I've been neglecting in the name of my social life. So there might be things there where you can kind of connect with your friends or your loved ones on an even deeper level when you're clear about your financial priorities. As we're getting into this, if you're noticing that you've got questions about your boundaries or about setting your financial goals and you want me to answer it, you can go to mindmoneybalance.com/ask. That's mindmoneybalance.com/ask and submit a question there. You can submit it with a pseudonym or you can submit it anonymously, but I might answer it here. Let's talk about some potential roadblocks of setting a boundary or about loud budgeting. Oftentimes, when we set a boundary, the people or the person who has most benefited from you not having a boundary before is going to be or are going to be the most upset by it. Why? Because they benefited off of your inability to say no or to not be a people pleaser or things like that. So there might be this friend in your friend group who is the instigator to get you to do the thing that maybe you don't want to do. So for example, maybe you're participating in dry January and they say things like, oh my gosh, just have a glass of wine. It's not the end of the world, right? They kind of instigate on you, setting a boundary, and then maybe around them, you don't really adhere to it and you're like, okay, whatever, yeah, I'll have a glass of wine. Or in this case, maybe this is the person who loves to take last minute vacations or plan more pricey get-togethers. And if you say like, oh no, I'm not really up for it, and you're not clear about why you have a boundary, they push back on you and they're like, come on, you can make it work. Who cares? Put it on your credit card. There's ones with 0% interest out there. Just like live a little. So when you start saying, no, I'm not actually going to buy that drink or spend money on that vacation, they're going to be the ones who are going to push back the most, who are going to have their feathers the most ruffled because they benefited from your ease of like, I hate to say it, but like being a pushover, being a people pleaser, right? We can also see this in families. If it is something like you live out of state and the rest of your family lives in another state, you might get a lot of pressure to come home, to come visit with the family, to have family time, but you might not have been clear that it's actually expensive for you to get there and it costs money. And not only does it cost money, but it's money that everybody else in your family doesn't really have to spend to see one another. Rather than saying something like, look, I can make it home for your anniversary or for our family reunion, but those are the 2 times that I'm going to make it home this year. What ends up happening if you don't have a good boundary there is that people may start guilt tripping you. They might say things like, oh, well, it's your cousin's graduation, but you'll be there in spirit, but I know they're going to miss you. Or they might say things like, you never know how long your grandma has. You have to get back home, right? They might really tug on your heartstrings. So if you're setting a financial boundary with family, expect it to be a little bit more intense and a little bit more layered because often there is history there around boundaries, and money is just a boundary that you might be starting to set or you might be starting to communicate, but it might also be that there are other boundaries that you haven't had or haven't been very strong that are also going to need some strengthening to adhere to this new financial boundary. The other thing about a boundary is that it is not set in stone. They're boundaries that we set. And so we might also be able to say, as we are embarking on this loud budgeting journey for a specific financial goal, we might be able to say, look, this might feel really weird, but this is a priority to me. So for the next 3 months, I'm going to be pulling back on these areas. Or saying something like, this is just until I can save up enough money to buy a new car, then I'll have more flexibility again. Sometimes when you can communicate with other people that this boundary is a temporary boundary that is in place for a specific type of goal, it helps them to get on board with you. They're not going like, oh my gosh, Lindsay's never going to want to hang out with us again. We better find some new friends. They're saying like, oh, okay, we can modify the way we hang out for the next 3 months. We can get creative. It's not a big deal. One thing about loud budgeting that I think is like making people really anxious is an example along the lines of, no, I'm not spending gas money to hang out with you, which might land to the other person as, you're not worthy of me putting gas in my tank to come visit you. So that's where being really clear about this being a financial boundary, not like an emotional one or a worthiness one, is really important. All right, so now we have kind of come full circle. We have learned that loud budgeting can be an amazing tactic to help you achieve your financial goals, but you might have to deal with some temporary emotional discomfort. And a perk of loud budgeting is that it might help you adhere to your goals, and it might help other people in your orbit start thinking about their goals, or maybe just even talking to you about money. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.